Severo, an interviewer for the Oral History Project of the Berkeley Historical Society. Today, June 6, 2022, I am with Sharon Pincus in Berkeley, conducting this oral history on Zoom. Good afternoon, Sharon.
Hello, Michael.
It's a real pleasure to meet you. Will you tell us about your childhood, where you were born, when you were born, something about your parents, your grandparents, and your siblings?
Okay, wow, that's a lot to give, but sure. So I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1947. My family had originally come from Lithuania, my grandparents, and they had come to South Africa in 1926. I was the oldest grandchild, the oldest sibling in my family. I have a brother and a sister. My brother Wayne is 3 years younger than I, and my sister Michelle, 8 years younger. My father was a physician, and my mother was a dress designer. My grandparents, shall I continue?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so my grandparents left Lithuania in 1926. That my grandfather came first to South Africa, and my grandmother followed a year later with 3 young children. My grandfather came first to pave the way, and he settled in a little town called Messina, which was like the northern outpost of South Africa on the border of what was then Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, in a copper mining town called Messina. And as the story goes, if you want some history, I always find this a little bit of an interesting story. My grandmother, God bless her, was a very strong woman, Kayla. My grandmother was Kayla. My grandfather was Zalman. And Zalman didn't like South Africa at all. He'd come from Vilna, which was a sophisticated city. He had studied in a yeshiva, and he'd come out to the boondocks in South Africa. And he said the first Yom Kippur, he had to take himself out into the bush with his prayer book, and it wasn't a very fun experience for him. And he almost thought of coming home. But of course, you know, at that time, the situation for Jews in Lithuania wasn't very pleasant. There was a lot of hardship, anti-Semitism, bad economics. And so my grandmother's brother, who had previously come out to South Africa, her brothers had come out to pave the way. One of my grandmother's brothers came back to Lithuania to get a wife. And before my grandfather could come back to Lithuania, she said, I'm coming back to South Africa with you. So she got ready with 3 young kids, one of them who was my mother and only a year old. And she got onto the ship via Southampton, and they came to Cape Town and then went up by train to Messina. So that's basically how my family got to South Africa. And there were a lot of South African Jews, or a lot of Jews from Lithuania, who settled in South Africa. And so my mother grew up in Messina, but when it was time for her to go to high school, they decided to come to Johannesburg, the big city, for a decent school. They'd sent the 2 older brothers on ahead to boarding school, but you wouldn't send a girl to boarding school. So they bought a house in Johannesburg. And at the age of 19, my mother met my father, Joe Getz, and as all Jewish parents wanted, you had to marry a doctor or a lawyer. So she found her doctor and she married him. It wasn't the greatest marriage, and they divorced after 27 years. But in the interim, I and my brother and sister were born, and we have a lovely, wonderful, close family who all happen to be in this area now.
Mhm. What drew your family to the northern part of South Africa? I mean, did they?
I guess there was money to be made there.
Oh,
My grandmother's brothers had come out, and the oldest brother, who actually left Lithuania when he was 14, and my great-grandfather, Ben Sion, I believe there's a photograph of him there, said, you need to go and pave the way for the family. So 2 other brothers came out, and then my grandfather, and I guess you go where opportunity takes you, you know. And so opportunity was there in this copper mining town. You know, South Africa was very rich in resources, gold, diamonds, natural minerals. And so they established themselves in Messina, and my grandfather had a concession store on the mines as well as a soda factory. And the itinerant African people used to come from all around to work on the mines. So that was the mainstay of his business.
what was there a Lithuanian colony there, or
Yeah,
you know,
well,
a landsman?
Landsman, absolutely, yes. One
Yeah.
heard that word all the time. Well, there was my grandmother's family. I mean, five siblings came out to South Africa. Those who stayed, there were 2 who stayed in Lithuania, and unfortunately they perished in the Holocaust. But they had their little community, absolutely. And of course, you know, the pattern was you go out into the country, you establish yourself, you start building your wealth, and then you move to the big city. So the mainstay of the South African Jewish community was actually Lithuanian. You know, one person comes out and they pave the way for the rest of the family, and then friends hear about it, and all their connections.
Yeah.
So it was actually a very strong Jewish community. And growing up in Johannesburg in the northern suburbs, there was a very Jewish feel about them. You know, if you want to go on to my schooling, I went to public schools. Our elementary school was at least 25% Jewish, and you definitely could feel that atmosphere and that milieu. On all the Jewish holidays, not only the high holy days like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but also Passover and Sukkot and Shavuot and Simchas Torah, we would miss 2 days of school for the Jewish holidays in order to go to synagogue. Not that my mother and father were synagogue goers or affiliated. They were more secular Jews, but my grandparents were. So I used to go to synagogue with my maternal grandparents, with whom I was very close.
In your schooling, you sent a couple of pictures. Let's see if maybe.
A high school photo of the Israeli dance group. School, a girls' high school. You know, schools were based on the British tradition in South Africa. South Africa having been a British colony and then part of the Commonwealth. And so it was an all-girls school. You had co-ed schools, some co-ed schools, and then boys' schools and girls' schools. So this was a group of Jewish girls in the school who formed an Israeli dance troupe.
Mm.
And we would perform for gymnastic displays, and I am in the back in the middle.
Mm. That one?
That one, yes.
Yes.
That's me.
Okay. So you learned Israeli dancing, and
Yeah, that we actually learned Israeli dancing in various youth movements. We
Yeah.
didn't actually learn it at school, but we formed our own group. So I used to belong to Betar, which was revisionist. I don't actually subscribe to that ideology anymore, but my friends were there, and then a lot of the other girls were in Habonim or other youth movements, and so we all, we came together with our common knowledge and passion and love, I suppose.
So this particular group of what is it, nine teenage girls. Some are Betar and others are Habonim.
Yeah.
So this group isn't just Betar. Did you grow up in a Zionist environment?
Yes, I suppose you could say that. Even though my parents were not religious, they were very strongly identified as Jews, and the state of Israel was a young state at that point. I guess this photo might have been in maybe 63, 62. So we were all very conscious and very proud of Israel, and it was very much part of our lives. I also learned Hebrew as an extra subject, not at school, but I took it privately all through my schooling days. And in South Africa, at the end of your schooling for graduation, you do what is called a matriculation, where you take 6 subjects, and I added a 7th subject, which was Hebrew, and sat for that exam as well.
Parents were not particularly religious, but strongly identified as Jews.
Right.
And how about your grandparents? Were they religious?
They belonged to synagogues, and they used, as a small child, I would go to synagogue with them on the high holy days. My mother didn't want to go. She couldn't read Hebrew, and she felt she couldn't understand it. And so my grandparents used to take me, and that kind of, I guess, instilled in me a special feeling of being Jewish, of going to synagogue, of knowing what it was about, and then learning Hebrew, and with that Jewish studies came together with it. I developed, I think, a much deeper understanding than my parents did. They were Jewish because they were born Jewish. Their parents spoke Yiddish, so they spoke Yiddish to their parents, but they spoke English to each other. My mother, I think, might have liked to have kept a kosher home, but my father wasn't interested. And so eventually we sort of tried. I remember initially not mixing milk and meat and having special dinner services for Passover and, during the year, but with the years that kind of fell by the wayside.
When you went to the synagogue, I guess it was a Orthodox synagogue where you sat with your grandma. and your grandpa sat on the floor, right?
Well, no, I often was downstairs with him, you know.
Oh,
He
really?
would take, yeah, kids could go downstairs.
Oh,
So he would take me downstairs for the times they walked around with the Torah so that I could kiss it and, you know, participate in the services, and he'd point things out to me and say, just wait, they're going to blow the shofar soon. And so I think a lot of my feeling and education came from that. And I have to tell you, I am not a religious person at all, but I do have that kind of tradition and culture instilled in me, and I know all about it, and I can appreciate it, and I can refer to it when I study my Yiddish literature. You know, I can appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, did you have a formal Jewish education? Did you? I mean, your parents were not affiliated, so.
Right.
I mean, in this country, you know, if you're going to have your children have a Jewish education, you have to affiliate basically with the synagogue that is offering it.
Right.
Was that the experience in South Africa?
No, it wasn't. As I said, I took Hebrew privately out of school. I used to have Hebrew lessons twice a week, and within that, there was a lot of Jewish history and customs and traditions that came out as I learned. And I guess a lot was by osmosis, and then belonging to Betar, sort of that filled me in on Jewish history and Israeli history, and so that's where and I guess because I was interested in it, it spoke to me, and so I kind of had an affinity for it. What is interesting is, and what shocked me when I was older, my mother said that her mother had never taught her how to the prayer for the Friday night candles. You know, it was amazing. I mean, my grandmother used to light the candles and say the prayer, and that's something that's always been a puzzlement to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the few roles that women play.
Right, one of the basics. Yeah. So it's been a mystery. I don't know. Then my question is, you know, why didn't my mother ask her to teach her? That's the other thing. I never got the answer to that, unfortunately.
Who paid for the Hebrew lessons?
Oh, my mother. I mean, she initiated them. I was young. I was in, I think, second grade when she started me with Hebrew lessons. And I guess because she felt inadequate in that regard, she didn't want to be. Yeah. And I mean, my brother had his bar mitzvah and he went to Cheder. My sister started with Hebrew lessons but gave them up. So I was the one who kind of carried it through to the end. And I guess, you know, to some kind of conclusion, doing it for matric. And
it like growing up in apartheid?
Oh, well, one of the questions you sent me was what was one of the influences on your life?
Yeah.
And growing up in the apartheid system was very much an influence. I mean, that's what prompted us to leave South Africa when I got married to Michael Pincus in 1971. We're since divorced, but still friends. But we knew that we had to leave South Africa for multifold reasons. One, because of the apartheid system, and we didn't want our children to grow up, in that kind of system.
Mhm.
And the other was because we were afraid of a bloodbath.
Mhm.
At the time when we left South Africa, apartheid was still very much entrenched. And I remember saying, I remember sitting and having lunch with our nanny, who was a Black woman, an African woman, wonderful person and very philosophical in her folksy wisdom. Everyone in South Africa had a maid and a manservant in the house, live-ins. I mean, that was just the way it was. And I used to sit and eat with her, and I used to say, Lena, doesn't it make you mad, apartheid, that you can't do this and you can't do that? And they would have to have their passbooks signed every month so that they could move freely about. And she used to call me Ladybird. And she was a church-going woman, very devout, and always reading her Bible. And she said to me, Ladybird, everything has a season. Now is the season for this, but one day there will be a season for something else. And I have never forgotten that. And indeed, that other season did come. So, we were very politically conscious. You couldn't live in South Africa with a conscience and not be politically conscious. And when I was growing up, when I was in high school, there were things like Mandela being an activist and the Lithuania trials. And another interesting story, when my mother was pregnant with me, she was working at an attorney's firm in Johannesburg, Sadelsky, I forget, something else, a Jewish firm. And she said there was this very handsome young Black man in the cubicle next to her. And she used to hear the senior head of the firm, Mr. Sadelsky, saying to him, now you must be careful when you go out and do all this stuff. Be careful or you'll get arrested. And when she read Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom, and he had mentioned the name of the firm, Sadelsky, it was a Jewish firm, and not many firms employed Africans. He was an intern, what is called an article clerk, while he was studying law. And she realized that this person who was working next to her was Nelson Mandela. She said she got goosebumps. So, while we grew up, there was a lot of Black activism. There were bombings at the Johannesburg station and the power stations. And being a student at Wits University in the 60s, there were English-speaking universities and Afrikaans-speaking universities. The English-speaking universities were by and large the more liberal. The Afrikaans universities followed the dictates of the nationalist regime and the apartheid government. So being a student in the 60s, we were part of the worldwide student uprisings, but we had our own very specific issues of being anti-apartheid, of standing up for academic freedom. I remember our student leaders were being arrested on 180-day detention without trial. People were dying at the hands of the South African police, and we were told it was suicides or people jumping or out of windows from John Forster Square, which was the prison then. So it was a very turbulent time and sort of had a profound impact on my thinking and my attitude towards people and humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there was a member of the South African Parliament. I think her name was Sussman or
Helen Sussman, yes.
Yes. Was she your?
She wasn't my representative,
Yeah.
but she was a representative in a very Jewish area. In Houghton. A lot of family members were under her, and she was a very courageous woman. I remember going to watch a parliamentary session, and they were having a debate. You know, it was like the British parliamentary system, not like American Congress. And who was speaking? Was it de Klerk or somebody? But she got up and she said to him, "Oh, keep quiet, you silly old man." But yeah, she was kind of a spearheader of the liberal movement, and we did try and vote in members with our philosophy.
Yeah. Got married in 1971.
Yes.
And you had two daughters.
Two daughters, Kerryn and Jodi. Yeah.
So, okay.
That's Jodi and her husband and two boys. She's the younger of the two daughters.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's their wedding. She got married to a Mexican man, and they had a wedding in Mexico. So you can see there's some of the Mexican tradition with the lasso around the neck and the Magen David at the bottom. And it was an interesting ceremony because my son-in-law is not Jewish, and we had to find a rabbi who would do an interfaith marriage. And so we had the marriage ceremony in a combination of Spanish, English, and Hebrew.
Now, how would you describe your children's affiliation with Judaism? I suspect Kerryn's is strongly Jewish in that.
They both are actually.
They are.
My ex-husband Michael was a principal of Jewish day schools. So from the time we were both educators, and so from the time we got married, he worked in a Jewish day school and became a principal. He worked in a Jewish day school in Johannesburg, was promoted to vice principal in Pretoria, then to principal in Cape Town, and then we moved to Australia before coming to the US, and he was principal of a Jewish day school in Melbourne, Australia, and he was also on the Jewish Board of Deputies in Pretoria, South Africa, when he was vice principal there. So my girls actually had their schooling in Jewish day schools. So they very much identify as being Jewish. And Kerryn's first husband also was not Jewish. And but the kids, you know, have had their brisses and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. Her second husband is.
But what year did you leave South Africa?
We left South Africa and we went to Melbourne, Australia for 3.5 years. And then Michael got a position at a Jewish day school in El Cerrito. And he was there for, I think, was it 1 or 2 years after we arrived. But the reason for coming to the Bay Area was my brother at that point was a professor at Cal, and he had gotten tenure. And my mom and stepdad had left South Africa and come to the Bay Area because my brother was here. He was the one who was settled. We were in Australia, which was too far. My stepfather's family had his children, my stepbrothers and sisters, had moved to Toronto in Canada. That was too cold for them. So they decided to come to the Bay Area. And then my sister, who had left South Africa with her husband and they went to Heidelberg, Germany, where her husband did his doctorate in nuclear physics. And then they went to Madison, Wisconsin, where he switched. He had a fellowship and then he switched to nuclear medicine, and he eventually ended up in the Bay Area at UCSF and the Veterans Hospital. So we've all, by circuitous routes, landed up in the Bay Area. So I have my sister here, my mother, my brother here, and my mom and stepdad when they were alive. My mother died about 3 years ago.
So is your brother still teaching at UC?
Yeah, he's now Professor Emeritus. And, you know, you've heard about the Wandering Jews. I think well, we are an exemplar of that.
Yeah, but now you're all settled in. And,
now we're here, and it's been wonderful to have that family closeness. I have to say we're a very close family.
Yeah. Tell us about your education. I mean, you went to university in South Africa, and then did you continue your education in Australia?
No, not Australia. In South Africa, I started off doing architecture, and I did 2 years of it and decided, no, that's not for me. I need to work with people. So I switched to a bachelor's and got my teacher's certificate. And then also in South Africa, I did what was the equivalent of an honors. It's like a postgrad degree, Bachelor of Education. I also got a speech and drama teacher's certificate, and did my special ed qualifications. So I switched to the special ed field, which I absolutely loved. And when I was in Australia, I worked at the Jewish day school. I also worked in Jewish day schools and taught initially English and history and some Jewish history, and then switched to special ed. And so I was the equivalent of a resource teacher in Australia. And when I came to the US, I got my master's in educational administration and did that in the field of special education. So I became a director first for a school for severely emotionally disturbed adolescents, and then I got into the public school system, and I was an administrator for 5 years in the Berkeley Unified School District, and then a director in San Rafael, and ended my career before I retired in the Moraga School District as Director of Pupil Services and Special Ed.
Since you've moved to Berkeley, since you've retired, what are your interests? How are you filling your days?
They're pretty busy, I have to tell you. I try and do my gym classes at least 3 or 4 times a week, not always successful at that. Before COVID, I used to go to the Albany Y, and since then I do them on Zoom. I have my Yiddish classes, my Yiddish group, the Mameloshn Mamas, and then some of us also take a formal class on Zoom. I have a New Yorker group where we read and suggest articles from the New Yorker to each other, and then we introduce them to the group and discuss them. I have a reading group. I belong to Berkeley Rep. I love theater, the San Francisco Symphony, opera, and travel. Travel's my passion. So, and then my family. So,
yeah. What was the first language you learned?
It was English. It was English, but in South Africa, it was compulsory to take a second language at school, and that was Afrikaans. If you were English speaking, you went to an English medium school and you learned Afrikaans as a second language. If you were Afrikaans speaking, you went to an Afrikaans medium school and you had to learn English as a second language. And then I heard a lot of Yiddish at home from my grandparents. My mother spoke Yiddish to her parents, but she spoke English to us. So, and then a smattering of African languages here and there, you know.
So what did you learn? Did you speak Yiddish to your grandparents?
I guess a word or two here and there. I probably understood a lot more than I realized, because when I started picking up on Yiddish in my retirement, I realized just how much I knew and how much I had imbibed, you know. I mean, I understood a lot of Yiddish. And here's a cute story also. You know, Yiddish is full of innuendo and sarcasm. So we had our manservant, Jeffrey, who had worked for my grandmother, my Bobba, and then he was working for us. And he wanted us, and he said to me, you know, my Bobba would say to him when she got fed up with something, oh, gay schlafen, you know, go to sleep or something. And he said to her, and he says, Sharon, what does gay schlafen mean? I said, oh no, sorry, not gay schlafen, oya chochem. Oh, a clever one, you know, she'd say sarcastically when he did something that he didn't like. And he said to me, Sharon, what is a chochem? I said, Jeffrey, it means a wise one. And he shook his head and he said, ay, Connor, that in African, that means, you are kidding me. Yeah, so.
So what drew you to Yiddish later on in your life?
You know, it's been with me my whole life. I mean, growing up in the milieu that I did, everybody used Jewish expressions. And so they kind of stay with you. And in a way, Yiddish is a kind of universal language for the words that have come into other languages. But I have always had that affinity. And when I came here, I spoke to one or two people who were taking Yiddish classes, and I was still in the workforce at that time. And I thought, gee, wouldn't that be great? I'd love to learn Yiddish and improve on it. So when I retired at the Y, I met Millie Chazen. We both sort of left a class early and sat out to recuperate. And she started talking to me. Well, what's your name? Chazen. And I'm Sharon Pincus. And you immediately, you know, click, click. Well, those are Jewish names. And then she says, oh, I've got to have energy because I've got this Yiddish singing group. So my ears pricked up. She says, we're having a concert. Wouldn't you like to come? So I said, yeah, sure. And then we sort of started speaking, and she told me that she went to a group at the JCC on Monday mornings. Not a class per se, but just a group who read Yiddish stories in transliteration, and then there was the English, somebody had the English translation that we could check on. And she says, anyone can come. So I thought, well, hey, I'll give it a try. So I went one morning and went for quite a while. And then a few women from the group said to me one day, do you want to come and have lunch with us? And they wanted to break away and start their own Yiddish discussion group and do some reading. They said, can you read Yiddish? I said, well, I can read Hebrew. So from that, you know, we wanted to read proper Yiddish texts. So we formed our group, and we eventually became the Mameloshn Mamas. And we started reading literature and translating and having a little schmooze in Yiddish. And it was a boon when COVID came along, because we'd meet on Zoom. Otherwise, we'd meet at each other's houses, you know.
Yeah. So the fact that you could read Hebrew, knew the letters,
Yeah.
I get the impression that you had one step a greater knowledge than some of the other women in the group.
Well, some of them could read, and actually, if you can read Hebrew, you can't automatically read Yiddish.
Oh.
You know, it's like Spanish and French, for example, and Italian. The spellings are different. The sounds are a little different. So I had to, but at least I knew the letters. So that was a head start. Yiddish is actually, yeah, it's a very phonetic language, but I always got a little confused with some of the things which I've now got straight. And I'm still not totally fluent as I'd like to be, but I can read it. I can read it and I can write it because you know, because of my Hebrew background.
Yeah. How has the Mameloshn Mamas evolved over time?
Well, I just think, you know, we've all remained there. The same 6 women who formed this group away from the JCC group have been participants. And I just think that our Yiddish gets better all the time, and we read literature. You know, we choose books where we can have a translation as well. And at the same time, a few of us started taking Yiddish classes with Noah Barrera on Zoom. He's a young man who teaches Yiddish. And because, I mean, the grammar is so difficult. I didn't realize it would be such a challenge. But, you know, I thought, oh, Yiddish easy. I know it's you know, but I don't. I've got a good basis, but to perfect it and to perfect the grammar is a challenge for me, with the different cases and the masculine and the feminine. Although if you've done Hebrew or French, there are masculine and feminine, you know, but Yiddish has its own challenges. And what I also realized the different dialects of Yiddish. When I came to Australia, there was a large survivors community in Melbourne, specifically a Polish community, and their Yiddish to my ear was different than the Litvakische Yiddish I had grown up with. So, you know, I've had to tune my ear into different dialects of Yiddish, and we in the Mameloshn Mamas all have a slightly different way of saying things.
Bobba, Kayla, and Zaida Zalman.
Right.
I think you should translate what Bobba and Zaida are.
Okay, Zaida is grandpa and Bobba is grandma, grandmother or granny, as we said in South Africa. So those are my mother's parents. And this photograph was taken maybe in 1958, somewhere around there. It's my grandparents with my cousins who had been born at that point. So I am on the far right-hand side next to my grandmother standing. And my sister is on my grandfather's lap. And my brother is directly in front of her on the ground with the toy aeroplane in his hands, yes. And then the others are first cousins, my mother's brother's children.
Let's see. This was also a, you have Bobba Kayla at the beach.
Kayla on the left at the beach, yes.
And then you have Grandma.
With a very sexy swimsuit. Probably in Muizenberg, which was nicknamed Jewsenberg because it was down in the Cape, and all the Jews from all over the country would flock to Muizenberg in the summer. And that's a whole other story. So she's on the beach there. The other photograph, my father's mother is in the middle.
Okay.
Grandma Ada, yeah.
Yeah.
My father's family was very musical, actually. One of my grandmother's sisters taught music, and my father could play the piano or pick up any instrument. He played by ear. Couldn't read a note.
Did you know your paternal grandparents?
I did, yes. That was Grandma Ada and Grandpa, we used to call him Grandpa Shlomo Solomon. And actually he was in the suburb of Kensington in Johannesburg. He was chairman of the Talmud Torah at the shul there, and I remember going to a ceremony once where he was honored. He was a lot more severe than my mother's father, who was very loving, and you know, I think I was closer to my mother's parents than to my father's. But we saw them regularly. They would come and visit every weekend. And my grandfather was a wholesale butcher in Johannesburg. He worked in the abattoir, so he would bring us meat twice a week. Yeah.
So how come you didn't call your paternal grandparents Bobba and Zaida?
I don't know, it's just the way it was. Yeah, actually we called my Bobba, but Zaida, we used to mostly call him Grandpa. Some of the cousins called him Zaida, some Grandpa.
What do you like about Yiddish? What does it mean to you?
It means a lot of things. First of all, it's a connection to my family. It's a connection to my people. It reminds me of my childhood. It's got some wonderful expressions. You know, it's the expression of a people. It's the thinking of a people. And it's also an international language. I mean, you can go anywhere and find people who speak Yiddish. You just have to throw out a Yiddish word and see who'll bite, you know, and so it's kind of in my blood. It's in my DNA.
Yeah. Outside the Mameloshn Mamas and the class that you're taking, are there other occasions in which you read or speak Yiddish? Do you speak Yiddish to your brother or other members of the family?
No, they don't know very much Yiddish. A word here or there. I mean, we use lots of Yiddish expressions, and my mother was always quoting my grandmother, you know, through the years. You know, she'd say to me, my mother would say this and my mother would say that. And so, but if you meet someone who speaks Yiddish, you will try and have a conversation. I did help someone who's writing a book and has a Jewish character in the book, and she wanted it to be authentic. She's not a Jewish person, so she wanted to inject some Yiddish phrases into the book, and it hasn't yet been published, so I can't really talk about it. But yeah, this character was a New York Jewish woman who was blind, and so I helped her with some of that.
Yeah.
And I now, because I'm interested in Yiddish, I find a lot of stuff on YouTube to listen to. I watch lessons on YouTube. I listen to talks on YouTube. Some I can understand, some not. But I mean, I'm much more aware of what literature has been written in Yiddish now than I ever was. And with the Mameloshn Mamas, we've been going through a book of poetry, which has been quite interesting and a delight, you know. So my horizons have definitely been broadened.
Yeah, appreciate your time that you spent with us to share your life and to share your knowledge and your love of Yiddish and what it means to you and your experience with the Mameloshn Mamas.